I'm going to start with you, Cary, with a question for you, because we just heard from Amity, and tell us about your first impressions of this novel.
This novel?
Yeah, first time you saw it. What first read through?
On a very practical level, I read the novel and made an offer on it immediately. But I think my first impression of the book was one of surprise, because I was rooting for a character who was clearly disturbed and doing some questionable things with his daughter, but I wanted him to win, whatever winning means. And so what I loved, so my impression was that I thought it took a really gifted writer to accomplish simultaneously my rooting for and being appalled by a character at the same time. And there wasn't a sort of packaged version of this protagonist that Amity was presenting to us, and I thought that was really, really interesting. But I wasn't surprised, because I had read Amity's other books, and I was really eager to see what it was she was going to do next. So,
But had you edited her other books?
I had not edited.
So this was the first.
Yeah, Amity was the first. So the imprint was launched in 2006, and just as I made my way over to the new offices, a friend of mine who was a writer had put a copy of Amity's first book, Oh My Darling, in my hands. And I read this book, and there was one particular scene that I'll never forget that made me absolutely fall in love, which is that in this book, and Amity will probably describe it differently and better than I would, but in this novel, you have this starter couple in their starter home who move into a new town and sort of claustrophobically begin to unravel really quickly. And the wife is ultimately abandoned by her husband and left with the husband's dead mother's dog. And there's a scene in which the wife's sitting on the bed in the bedroom, and the dog is sitting in the corner of the room. And the guy, she's looking at the dog, and the way Amity writes the scene, she's thinking to herself, this is my home. And she's, vying for territory with the dog. And somehow you manage to sort of follow that with the dog looking at the wife and sort of blankly thinking, there's no such thing as a home. It was this sort of Zen koan moment that just made me want to read everything she had written. So it was the first author I wrote when I got there, and I was pretty much committed to finding a way to publish it.
I see.
I just looked at the email that he sent me. It was November 6, 2008.
And what did he have to say?
It was just, I read your book, I read Oh My Darling, and I just want to tell you who I am, and want to read, hear what you're working on, if anything.
It's a very, very selling email.
That's really.
And then we had some lunches and got to know each other, but it was a while before. Yeah.
3 years.
A long time.
Yeah.
So an agent did not bring you together? No. So interesting. When you first met about this book, did you talk about some of the, there's some kind of topical, some immediacy to the book, some kind of, there's the whole Rockefeller story, there's a story. Did you speak about that, or was that just put to the side and you were just really looking at the novel?
Certainly it came up, but I think as it happened, I don't think it was a story that either one of us was following very closely. You can talk about how it inspired you.
So that aspect, when I first read that real life story, it was...
And do you know the story?
The what?
The man named Clark Rockefeller, he called himself Clark Rockefeller, but he was actually not a Rockefeller. He was a German immigrant who, it's familiar, right? But and then he also had a young daughter and also a custody battle. So there's definitely echoes there. But the one part of that story that's really stuck with me, and I haven't followed the case since I first read that short article in 2008, was when the man who called himself Clark Rockefeller was apprehended, also kidnapping his daughter. He said that the days with his daughter had been some of the happiest of his life. They had been wonderful days that they spent kind of on the run together. And I started to wonder, did he really love this girl? Did she love him? Was he capable of loving her, despite the fact that he was a fraud and a con man? And the book just kind of took off from there, and it's not a novelization of that story, but I needed that quote to write the book.
Well, what's so brilliant about the way you sort of pivoted from the news story into a fictional account is that, you know, there's a holistic approach to Eric's own personal history. And so you've got this East German immigrant to Boston who makes up, you know, the only fake story an immigrant boy in working class Boston would make up. You know, my name is Kennedy and I'm from Cape Cod. I mean, it's an obvious lie for a young boy wanting so desperately to be American. It's the most American story he could imagine. And then the East German split from its West German half. You know, this idea of divorce and separation winds up playing into larger themes in the book in this really clever way. And so you move away from the actual news, you know, pretty deftly and you know, within the context of the world you're creating here. And it works on its own terms. So it's probably why we didn't talk very much about it.
Because it really moves over away from that story and into a story about the reinvention of self, and especially for an immigrant or the child of immigrants, which I think is a story which resonates, that resonates with a lot of people. That sense, he is the radical version of that, in that he does completely reinvent himself in a way that should not be plausible at all, but is plausible to people he meets. But I think on other levels, it's something that a lot of people can understand and relate to.
Yeah, I think a lot of immigrants come here trying to escape something, not even escape something literal the way that Eric really does. But they're not all missing the home country, you know. Some of them want to come and completely forget.
Right.
And you can do that here, you know, and you can change your name. You can if you want to, or your name gets changed accidentally by someone else. And I don't think there's any other place in the world quite like, you know, this country for that disappearance of your past.
As an editor, when you were working with this novel, there are these threads in the novel, these kind of themes that, you know, about identity, about parenting, and it's almost a road novel in a way. Maybe it is a road novel. Yeah, buddy, it is. You're right. So, as an editor, what was your role in thinking about those things?
So little. Honestly, the things, any editor's ideal role, I think, is probably just to be a first close read, more than anything else, and to sort of be able to read as closely many iterations through and ask questions. You know, there are writers who come in who maybe in the nonfiction realm are an expert in a certain field and really need line editing. I mean, Amity is just a gorgeous stylist. That was never the issue. What I might have asked questions about were redundancies or repetitions, accidental things that come up, or inconsistencies, but I'll never forget. Our first editorial meeting was a 3-hour conversation in my office where I just was asking you questions about who these people were, because I felt my role was less about imposing something on the manuscript that Amity wasn't doing, and more about just understanding who her characters were so that I could be of some use. That's what I felt my role was.
It seemed a little bit like if I had an explanation, you were okay with that. You know, if I was doing something deliberately and I had a reason for it, he was on board. You know, and he just wanted to know what that reason was for a bunch of things. So I liked that a lot. I mean, I felt with Cary that he had accepted sort of my sensibility and, like, in general was on board. You know, and that really helped me to have those conversations. There was that fundamental trust, you know, there.
Probably the thing we spoke most about, the two things that we actually spent the most time talking about, which would have been the footnotes and the ending.
That's right. That's right. There's footnotes in the book, not very many, and you wanted some of them to be, I think there were, you know, it was a debate of like, should some of the text be a footnote and some of the footnotes disappear, you know? And
Right.
so we did a little bit of that. At the ending, there were Cary and a couple other early readers. I wanted to end on a footnote, and that wasn't working. So I had to have like a couple people tell me that before I finally let it go, and then I let it go.
So that, I'm very curious about this. So the change was how you ended it structurally. So you ended it without a footnote, but you did, was there a different ending?
No, I wanted.
He said yes.
No, it wasn't that there was different ending. It's that you had basically parallel endings.
Right. I wanted the reader to like read both the text and the footnote at the same time. You know, or something like, I don't know quite what my idea was.
You now understand that's an impossible.
Now I understand it's actually physically impossible.
We can't do that.
So you know, then I learned that I should move the footnote up into the primary text, and so it's the new ending, and I think it's stronger that way. Yeah.
It also pays off. I mean, I think the way your book ends right now, we sort of go on this long journey, and in many ways we return home with Eric because we have some better idea in those last 2-3 pages of where it is he comes from. To some degree, you know, it comes back to his origins. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah. It was one of those, writing the very end was one of those things, a nice moment as a writer where you are surprised by what you write. And I wrote a scene that it's, I think, an odd scene. It's not crucial to the narrative in any particular way, but it's part of your understanding of him as a whole person. And I didn't know that was there. So when I wrote that scene, it was gratifying to know I had come to know him well enough that he told me something that I hadn't known about his emotional life, makeup.
The way you describe working with Amity, is that in general the way you work with writers?
No, I think
or is it writer by writer?
It's absolutely and totally writer by writer.
Yeah. So it wasn't the same experience, say, with Christopher Hitchens?
You get out of Christopher's way.
I had a feeling.
But surprisingly, not to be after, you know, a guy like that is sort of so sure-handed that when you do have a question about whether something belongs or not, there's maybe 1 out of 10 things he really feels strongly about, and the rest you can do what you want. You know, he was a deadline writer, like you're in charge.
But so the process really does change, writer to writer. And does it change? Has the process of working with an editor, you work with different editors, but do you have an ideal process for working with an editor? Or are you just open to the editor's styles changing?
I'd be open to an editor's style. I do feel like that there does have to be this fundamental acceptance of what kind of writer you are. There's not a questioning of the foundations of what you're doing, because that would be difficult to negotiate. But other than that, I'm an obsessive reviser, and it's a little bit of something I kind of try to keep a secret. But I actually appreciate when people give me something to gnaw on, and so I like the editorial process. I'm also a teacher, and I get students to have to take my criticism, so I'm on board with that. I like that.
Do you revise as you write, or do you wait till you have a full first draft and then revise and continue to revise after that?
This particular book, was written very quickly for me. In only about a year and a half. My first book took like 7 years to chisel out. And so this one was more, it wasn't as painstaking, or, you know, to do it. And so I think that I finished it, and this one I kind of wrote through and then revised. Because I had to keep the flow in a way, and that felt good to be able to have flow. It's hard to find.
Yeah. I'm really curious, Cary, about how your history informs how you work with a book internally and externally, because you did publicity, and so I'm wondering how you think about. Is that informing your whole process from the time you look at a manuscript all the way through until all the, I mean, there must be a lot of internal work you have to do to market the book internally. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how your experience in Publicity?
Sure. I think it plays out more with our nonfiction projects than it would our fiction projects. We have a unique list. It's a rather small and curated one. Nonfiction is not only about feeling passionate about a project or a subject, but having a vision for how you actually publish it and what that publicity campaign, for instance, might look like. And you either do know what to do with it, or think you know what to do with it, or you know that you don't know what to do with this. I think for fiction, and Amity's novel is the perfect case, you know, first and foremost, because we publish one novel a season, because I think we can credibly communicate, and I say we, Brian, and Amity talked about before, as my partner in crime, we can credibly communicate to the rest of the company, you know, our genuine passion for one novel. As soon as you start to say, you know, this is, you know, so wonderful, it's a novel we're publishing, this novel is also so wonderful, and people start to kind of glaze over. So we can credibly publish, I think, one novel. And the thing about a book like this is that whether I was working, I mean, I said before, I was a fan of Amity's A Priori, so whether I was working on this book or not, it would be a book I had at home, that I was reading, that mattered to me, that informed things about, you know, either what it is I get from fiction or about myself and my life. And it's a book, frankly, that changes you. I've now lived with this, as you've had for longer than I have, but 2 years, and I was looking through this before our conversation tonight, and it changes, you know, and the way I read it changes. You know, things in my life have changed, so I now think about Eric and his relationship to his daughter in a different way. And that's the sign of a really great book, that you discover new things in all the time. So as it concerns fiction, but the thing is, let's get back to the publicity part of it. What's wonderful about this, we have a sales force who organize, they have their own book club that's determined by nothing. They read books that are published by other companies as well. And they read this last year for the book club, and they were so excited by it and so split on their opinion of the protagonist that they actually called us up and said, would you mind if we invited Amity to come in and join us for our conversation? So Amity came to New York, joined the sales club, and we watched these 12 women, you know, literally fight over the course of an hour during lunch about whether he was dangerous and a lunatic, or whether he was a flawed but loving father. And some people got very upset about it. And Brian and I sat there just kind of smiling, because that was exactly the response. And I guess what I'm getting at in a long-winded way is that, you know, you'll get great reviews, but we also know there would be a conversation about the book beyond.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, there are going to be 1,000 conversations like that all across America about this book. This is going to be a book that's really going to be, I think, talked about in book clubs a great deal, because it does raise those questions, and you know, it never really results in a way. I mean, it's the ambiguity of all the characters. I mean, the father is a really beautiful and kind of sad character too. There are no good guys and bad guys, but that's what makes it so compelling. That while you're reading, you're thinking, is he insane, or is he just a man who loves his kid, you know? And it never really, you don't get the definitive answer. Right? I think that's what makes it so wonderful.
When I gave one of my first readings from this book, before it was done at Amherst College, I had a similar experience of people asking me questions and being upset, saying, you want me to sympathize with this guy? And then someone else saying, well, I sympathize. Started talking to the audience, we started to talk to each other and say, you know, well, what do you mean? I wouldn't do this in his situation. And I did secretly enjoy that conversation.
You said the book continues to change for you. You see other things in the book. And what about for you? You just, you know, do you read it at all? Do you look at it?
I just read it recently to prepare for interviews, and I did it straight-faced different. I don't think that's a question. I think, again, because I wrote it quickly and it's still just very new to me, I didn't have a profoundly different experience. I don't think I have distance from the book yet. Sometimes I still get questions and they don't penetrate my mind. I don't understand the question. So I think I have enough critical distance from the book to understand all the questions I get.
From the time you began writing until now, have you found that your role in publicizing the book has really changed? Are you doing more? Are you doing different things to help this book gain attention than you would have, say, for your first novel? Are you doing the kinds of, are you on Twitter? Do you do Facebook? Do you do all these things that writers are encouraged to do? She does, it's okay.
I don't know. Not Facebook. I've been doing a fair amount. I mean, it's wonderful. I was excited to have an NPR interview recently, and doing a lot of this has changed since my last book was published. Is a lot of things get sent to me. I do a lot of emailed interviews, and every day in the past week I've done a different one. New York Times was just the other day, which I think is up now, and you know, it's interesting. Normally I would really be very precious about those things, but I have a baby at home, I have a job, so I've been knocking them out a little faster than I would normally, and that's been good. So I've been trying to represent the book in my own words as much as possible, trying to say different things, not the same thing. And I've learned a lot from the questions about how I feel about the book and what I intended with it. So I'm becoming kind of more conscious of my intentions.
You know, the series that we're doing this year is actually author, editor, and agent, and so we're very sorry that your agent can't be here or passed away. Wendy Weil, the agent, an absolutely amazing woman. And are you now settled in and not with her agency? And I'm just curious about where you go next. I know that's it. You can just say, "Oh, I can't answer that."
Oh no, I mean, so her agency, I mean, is not really active anymore, and her two co-agents are here, and they have moved to Brandt and Hoffman, and I've gone as well there, and I can't believe she's not here. I mean, how she, Wendy. Years and years ago, I mean, Oh My Darling's a pretty quirky book. I mean, she had to work really hard to place that one. And, she never stopped. She never gave up on it. She picked it out of the slush pile, basically, and never stopped believing in the work. And I wish you were here because it's a full circle, a lot of her belief in me and is a total writer. So she's very missed. She was an agent and a friend, and she knew my family and cared about me and sent me scarves every year. I had a lot of scarves. She was very, I think, unique. I don't know. She was my first, and only experience.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing woman. But you said something so interesting about that she had faith in your first book, which was such a quirky book, and she took that on. And she did that with many books that I thought were risky books. And I wonder, as you think about how you build your list, do you think about building a list of a certain kind of fiction, or not?
Probably, if you look back after years and line up somebody's favorite novels, you'll be able to figure out a thing or two about them. But again, I love or I don't love. I don't think I'm so schematic about it. It's pretty much on the gut.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in all honesty.
But now, when you look back, do you say, "Oh, it's clear to me that this is the way I think about the novel"?
Well, the best thing about Amity's novels is that they were talking animals. They're starting to become a problem on my way.
Can you just name quickly some of the other?
Talking animals?
Yeah, some of the other fiction you've done.
You mentioned Benjamin Hill's The Evolution of Bruno Leopold.
Yes.
Which was mistaken to be a novel about a talking chimp, or only about a talking chimp, but was in fact one of the great sort of immigrant novels ever written. We're talking about immigrant novels. That book had, more in common with a book like Invisible Man by Robert Ellison than it did with Henrietta Morgan.
That's true.
Fable. I still think that's a great complicated book. I also published this book last year called Albert of Adelaide, and this became a problem because an agent who I see as a contributor to the center here had sent me this novel, and she pitched me on the phone, and I cut her off. I said, I just published a talking chimp. I'm not publishing a talking platypus. It's not going to happen. She said, do me a favor, just read the book. And I went home and I read it, and I walked into Brian's office the next day. I was like, yeah, you're going to kill me. But I just read this book about a talking platypus, and it's fantastic. And the thing about that book, which is very different than, Amity's writing about sort of life issues and existential issues, love, marriage, parenthood, childhood. This novel about the platypus was really a sort of, it was kind of a Western. It was like a Western, and it was exactly the kind of book you want to read when you don't want to read what you have to. And it just sort of turned everything off, and I read it in a sitting, and it was just like what the great storytelling should do. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know what these add up to, but that's a sampler of some of the stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like there's not one kind of book for
No,
each.
there's not one.
Yeah. I want to open it to questions from the audience because I'm sure you have questions yourself, and I want to take enough time for them. And the questions can be about Schroeder, about the relationship between editor and writer, or anything you want that's literary.
Thank you. That was a beautiful excerpt you read. When is the story taking place? Is it today? Is it in the 70s? Like, what's the actual time frame?
So it takes place in about 2009.
So
yeah. He talks a little bit about the recession, so it's contemporary. It's very recent.
Yeah. So Amity, you said you wrote it in a year and a half, and it sounds like you guys were sort of in conversation on some sort of friendly, hey, how are you? Professional basis. So I'm always really curious. Were you keeping the project sort of close to you? Were you telling him as you were working on it, I'm working on this novel, loosely inspired by the sort of Clark Rockefeller, or did you wait until you had a full draft to let him in on what the project was?
I was working on a different book for a while, and in fact, when I first saw this article about Clark Rockefeller, I was in Latvia, where I was researching a book about the great Latvian American novel that I was trying to write. Yes, no, we don't really need one like it. And I just wasn't getting through to that. And some of it, and some of that remains. I cut a lot. Some of it remains, and I still want to work on. But and when I saw this article, it just so many other personal events in my life. It just all came together around this new parenthood, the death of my father. Well, he hadn't died at that point, but so much that it just was the one thing I needed, the springboard, and so it came out quite quickly. Mm-hmm. And I went away. I had a couple residencies, and then I took some time. There was a little cabin in Vermont that I did a fair amount of writing in, and I would go for just a long weekend and just write. And so, because it was done that way, I finished it first before sharing it with anybody. And I kind of think that's, for me, that works. But I have friends, and I'm now doing it with other friends who are like, it takes, if I had just shown you this book, after the first 3 chapters, I might have avoided years of going down the wrong path, or if we had discussed this, with your close readers earlier, then it'd be more efficient, So I'm trying that now with others, and I would like to be able to do that. I think it depends on the project, right? If you're stuck, and you really need it. But if you have the flow, then don't talk to anybody, because if you have flow, then you can never recreate that. But if you don't, you know, I mean, so if you write something that's a mess, but you've written it in with inspiration, then you can go back and revise it, because you can do that at any point. But you can never recapture the inspiration or manufacture the inspiration. So.
Other questions?
What's your company? 12?
12 is the opening of the Hachette Book Group, which had formerly been Warner Books. So the imprint is called 12, and it was created with the mission of publishing no more than 12 books a year, or what amounts to.
Yeah.
How do you have the courage to, when you're working with an editor, if there's something that he or she says to you that you don't like, how do you deal with that?
There was only one thing that Cary said. You kind of threw it at me. See, now we get to air this out. This is very good. About the issue that he was a Kennedy. You thought that Kennedy was like too recognizable a name. Because for me, to make him a Kennedy, I knew I needed him to have an identity that was very iconic and American. That's his fabricated identity. And I wanted it to be over ambitious in a way. He calls himself a Kennedy. His real name is Schroeder. And I chose Kennedy, and then I saw the German connection. Kennedy had gone to Berlin, you know, and we all know what he said there, and so I wanted him to be Eric Kennedy, to be his real fake name. And I remember that you had problems with that initially. You were like thinking about it. You thought maybe was that too recognizable? Was it overdone? I think you had done a book recently on some Kennedy issues.
We do have a Kennedy thing out, but it wasn't that. It was I just wondered if it would be credible. But I mean, your book sells it. You sold it.
So in general, I feel like when someone gives you criticism, you can tell, you kind of go and check in with yourself, and you know, is it feel true or does it not? And sometimes it feels true, you know. And there were some other issues where I was like, oh, that feels true. And then other issues like the Kennedy one, that didn't feel true. I felt like it was worked into the book well enough. It was an interesting level to the book that I wanted to keep. And fortunately, he was fine with that later. So it was a compliment, you know. It wasn't an issue. Do you know what I mean? Like you know. The concept of the only truth you bring to the mountaintop is the one you bring with you, you know. Like that's the concept of working with someone. Like you're there, someone recognizes something that's a struggle about your work, and you already know that that's the case somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I just have a follow-up to that question. So how do you handle those kinds of disagreements?
There are some that you feel very strongly about, pretty confident about. There are others where there's something gnawing at you that you sort of address and put it out there. And then there are times, you know, I would say the majority of the time, you say to a writer, this is your book, and you've got to write the book you want to write, but this is what I think. And sometimes you negotiate. And you say, I'll give you that if you give me this. And usually you meet each other close to halfway, if not entirely. But again, like I said before, I mean, I don't think there are obviously there are some really great, seasoned, experienced editors who can speak with a certain kind of authority. My feeling about our role, and like Amity said before, she has first readers, you know, and these are people she's known for a long time. Most of them I'm gathering are writers, and they're people you trust. And, you know, you're not the only line of authority on this. We're merely a trusted, close reader with an eye towards the other part of that process, which is not the creation only, but the publishing and the ushering it out into the larger world and the problems that come along with that. So, you know, there isn't just one sort of voice from the sky saying this is right or wrong. It's just another, you know, another voice in the echo chamber, and ultimately, Amity's going to be the judge about what belongs or doesn't. We bought the book because we trust that she has a vision.
Are there other questions? Any other questions?
I want to ask one question, which is that nobody spent much time talking about April Almond. And I was wondering, there's a particular character in the book who was one of my favorites. And there's, I wonder if you just talk about sort of where April came from. She's a fascinating character to me because she's this like sort of obviously a flawed person. She wears it on her sleeve, and she's just so sort of well drawn. And where did that come from?
She's a character that he encounters on this journey, and they spend some time with her.
Yeah. I guess in some ways she's a reinvention of his marriage, but with someone maybe more appropriate for him. So his first wife, Laura, who is really not in the book, but we understand what she feels, is more of a sort of serious, straightforward, respectable person. And then when he goes on the road and he meets April Almond, you know, she's more suited for him, and they have a kind of fondness, though it's temporary, a recognition of each other as code freaks or something, and they have a genuine connection. And I think how I came up with her, that is a great question. But I think that sometimes I start characters by just a line of dialogue, and she has some kind of one-liners, and those came to me first. And I was like, who could I give that line to? And she grew up around that. Oh My Darling started the same way, some dialogue. I'm like, who is speaking? And that's how the characters get created.
There's a song. She was famous for.
She's famous for inspiring a rock song, which is not a real rock
Can you
song.
sing us the rock
No,
song?
I can't.
Can you?
Yeah, can you?
All right, there's one thing I want to say before we drink some wine, which is we were talked about selling the book, and I meant to mention this when I was doing the introduction, but look at this cover. This is such a fantastic cover. I love it, and I read it when it didn't have that cover on it, and so when this came in, I was beyond excited about it.
It's a beautiful book.
Isn't
Everything
it
about
beautiful?
it.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and so buy one. And thank you all very much.